So Anna is talking on change or stability, how Brexit and the COVID-19 pandemic affected higher education internationalisation policies in Europe. And I think this is part of a book. Anna, is that right? Have you've written a book about this? Yeah. So it looked like a really interesting top-end book. And there are the slides. So with no further ado, the screen is yours, Anna. And perhaps you could just ask Rachel to next slide, please, when you're ready.
Yes, I cannot. For some reason, I also can't see the slides. I don't know what's going on. But okay, I will just start. And Rachel.
So Rachel, can you put it into slideshow mode, Rachel?
Oh, they're not in slideshow mode. Okay.
No.
Is that better?
That's better. That's brilliant. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And if you want me to tell you what's on any of the slides, just let me know.
Yeah. For some reason, I can't see. I just see your screen like locked. Okay, but I will just get started. So I will open them alongside. Okay, so thanks everyone for bearing with me and the technical issues. I'm very happy to present here the results from my PhD work, actually, which were published last year by Palgrave Macmillan. And the study is titled Higher Education in an Age of Disruption, and it is a comparative study on English, French, and German higher education internationalization policies reacting to Brexit and the COVID-19 pandemic. Yes, okay, next slide, please. And keep pressing. Again, yes. So student mobility and the internationalization of higher education are prevalent features of today's university, as many of you know. You're also doing research on it. In fact, by 2016, nearly 5 million students globally were pursuing a degree abroad. And Rachel, click again. In Europe, the three most popular destination countries have traditionally been the United Kingdom, Germany, and France. Next slide, please. The rise of student mobility is, of course, a byproduct of globalization and facilitated travel, but it has also been actively promoted by actors such as the European Union. For instance, the Erasmus program was founded in 1987, and it's the world's biggest exchange program, and it provides students with stipends to study abroad. And the Bologna reform, which started in 1999, has resulted in the harmonization of higher education systems and similar degree structures. And for decades, the trend was clear: growing student mobility and an increasing integration of the European higher education area. Next slide, please. And click again and again. Enter the age of disruptions. Brexit in 2016 meant that for the first time in history, a member state was leaving the European Union. And there was a lot of speculation about what this would mean for higher education, as it had never happened before. In 2017, for instance, the news outlet Politico wrote, "No sector left unscathed. Brexit threatens to wreak havoc in many of Europe's biggest sectors, from fish supplies to greenhouse gas cutting measures to student exchange programs." So, of course, the Erasmus program in particular was being discussed about, as it wasn't clear if the UK would stay in it or not. Click again, Rachel, please. And again. In 2020, exactly 5 years ago, the world was hit with the COVID-19 pandemic. And I'm sure you all remember vividly the first months of the health crisis and the lockdowns and the uncertainty surrounding almost every aspect of life, including education. And there was also, again, a lot of speculation as to what this disruption would mean for higher education and internationalization. The journal Nature, for instance, published in the early months of the pandemic an article that said, "Universities will never be the same after the coronavirus." And in particular, it was speculated that the pandemic would ring in an era of digital transnational education. Next slide, please. And click again. Yeah. And these speculations led to the formation of the research question of my dissertation. How have Brexit and COVID-19 impacted higher education internationalization policies in different country contexts? Click again. In terms of country cases, I selected England, France, and Germany, since they are the most internationalized European higher education systems in terms of inbound student mobility. We just saw this on the statistics, but also in terms of the research design. They are very interesting to compare because they represent different types of higher education systems, with England being market-based, France being more state-dominated, and Germany having the Humboldtian system where there's state funding and the academic community still has quite a bit of influence. Next slide, please. Theoretically, my study is anchored in new institutionalism. And Rachel, you're going to have to do a bit of clicking now, yes. New institutionalism looks at how institutions such as the state or the church or the family provide social stability and define what is appropriate behavior. And higher education can also be considered one of societal institutions as it regulates, for instance, access to professions and comes with culture-specific norms and practices. Click. There are different strands of new institutionalism, and historical institutionalism is especially suited for my research question as it explores how institutions develop over time. A key concept here, click, is path dependence, which states that there are certain lock-in effects that keep institutions pretty stable over time. So for instance, those who are in power in an institution are of course interested in maintaining that power, or an institution might define what is considered legitimate or appropriate behavior. Think of, I don't know, the 10 Commandments in church. And according to new institutionalist theory, there are, however, ways in which an institution can change. Click. For instance, there can be an exogenous shock, which can lead to a critical juncture. Click again. Or change can be of predominantly endogenous origin, and this is the case when the institution changes from within. So when the actors carry out gradual institutional change, for instance, by layering new policies on top of existing ones. You might think of an example of introducing a private education sector on top of a public one, and then this might over time also change the ways in which the public education sector changes. So historical institutionalism helps me look at developments over time, but how can I capture higher education as an institution in its various facets? Click again. This is where sociological institutionalism comes in. It allows me to explore the features of an institution. Click. Richard Scott has defined 3 pillars of institutions, and these are regulative, normative, and cultural cognitive, and they exist within every institution. For the internationalization of higher education, the regulative dimension concerns, for instance, visa policies, or the rules that stipulate how higher education can be accessed, or the stipend rules surrounding the Erasmus program. Norms concern common values and standards, which are propagated, for instance, by internationalization officers or agencies such as the German Academic Exchange Service or the British Council or Campus France. And they define the programs and activities that are typically carried out. The cultural cognitive dimension concerns taken-for-granted ideas. And I operationalize this as the idea of whether internationalization is carried out from a collaborative or a competitive point of view, and whether internationalization is mostly governed by the state, the market, or the academy. Next slide, please. And click. And so I combined this diachronic long-term perspective of historical institutionalism with the operationalization of institutions by Scott in an analytical framework. And this begins with the antecedent conditions, which states how the status quo manifested across the 3 institutional dimensions. So what were the rules, norms, and cultural cognitive ideas before the disruptions? The antecedent conditions are then hit with the disruptive event, click, which is either Brexit or COVID. And then, click again, the the disruption opens up a window of opportunity during which institutional self-reinforcing mechanisms are potentially unsettled. So for instance, with Brexit, there was now this window of opportunity where these rules that had surrounded the relationship between the EU and the UK for a very long time, they were being renegotiated. And in terms of COVID, we will later see that the legitimization aspect was very interesting because, of course, the pandemic changed what we considered appropriate action. And then, click again, I look at the impact of the disruption and what happened across the three institutional dimensions during the time frame of 2016 to 2021. So these were the first 5 years after Brexit and the first 2 years of the pandemic. Next slide, please. And based on this model, we have 3 competing institutional trajectories. If there is change in all 3 dimensions, so regulative, normative, and cultural cognitive change, marked in color blue, click again, Rachel, please. This would mean radical change, click again. So this is the first trajectory, radical change in all 3 dimensions. The second scenario is then change that occurs in 1 or 2 dimensions. And in this scenario, I assume that the cultural cognitive dimension is the one that is most likely to remain stable, since culture and taken for granted ideas are very resistant to change. And then we also have a final scenario, which includes no substantive change across any of the dimensions. So it might be that rules were slightly adjusted. Let's say during COVID, the cost of living increased, so Erasmus stipends were increased a little bit, but this is something that is within the normal trajectory. So this, for me, would qualify as overall stability. So yeah, 3 different competing scenarios. Next slide, please. And with this analytical model in place, the research question was then further refined to, was there radical change, partial change, or overall stability? And to answer this question, click, I interviewed 44 experts across the 3 countries, and those were senior internationalization officers at the university level, so mostly the heads of the internationalization unit, and policymakers at the national level. And these included people from the education ministries in the 3 countries and people working for the internationalization agencies, so the German Academic Exchange Service, British Council, and Campus France. And I did these interviews between September 2020 and December 2021. I also conducted a document analysis, which included more than 200 national and organizational strategies, click Rachel, and also policy briefs and press releases and many, many news items. As I was uncovering the events as they were unfolding, there was, of course, not a lot of academic literature yet. So the main source also was just news items that came out on the different crises. I then conducted, click, a qualitative content analysis following Lohse and Laudel using the software Max QDA. And I also triangulated the data with the very limited secondary literature that was available. Yeah, moving on to the next slide, which concerns the findings, starting with the first disruption and with Brexit. Next slide, please. And the first country that we will look at now is England, where I found partial change. So you see the blue in the regulative and normative dimension, this indicates change. So in the regulative dimension, after many years of uncertainty, so you all watched this unfold, the Brexit regulations were quite protracted. So after years of uncertainty, the UK decided on the displacement of existing EU law. And as part of the hard Brexit, EU students lost their preferential access conditions and freedom of movement, because before there was this law that within the EU, all students have the same access conditions, so also the same tuition fees. in case there were tuition fees in the university system. And this was then, of course, changed. And in a very unexpected move, the UK also decided to leave Erasmus and introduce its own mobility program, the Touring Scheme. In the normative dimension, the government really tried to push towards a globally oriented commercial strategy in line with its Global Britain strategy. So this meant looking beyond the EU and tapping into new markets, for instance. The higher education sector, however, awakened to the prospect of losing its European partners and actually reinforced its commitment to them. So many universities created more EU partnerships in response to Brexit or deepened their relations. So there was this big normative clash between the government and the higher education sector. And I can illustrate this with a quote from one of the interviewees. Click, please. So one of the people I interviewed in England said that Brexit was kind of a kick in the teeth because the UK university sector was massively pro-European. I mean, we flew the EU flag for weeks after Brexit from the main building. And there was a letter from the UK vice chancellors to the government saying, don't do it. What we realized basically was that we hadn't been paying enough attention to our European partners because it was always taken for granted. It's a problem we have in the UK with a kind of exceptionalism that needs to be addressed. And I found this element of British exceptionalism particularly striking and looked more into it. Click again, please. And what I found in the cultural cognitive dimension then is that this clash between British exceptionalism and European integration that was unfolding within the government and with the government and the higher education sector actually isn't new. And throughout the post-war era, England has always had a very ambivalent relationship with the EU. We can see this already, for instance, in speeches from Winston Churchill, but also in England's internationalisation strategy since the 1980s, where England was a bit of an outlier with its competitive market-based approach and limited engagement in Erasmus. So it was taking part in Erasmus, but it always sort of had its outlook beyond that also because it was the only country that had a market-based higher education system. So partial change in England, regulative and normative change, but overall the stability of this tension. For France, I also found partial change with the same pattern in line with EU law. France reacted to Brexit by recategorizing the UK to third country status, which means that British students now require a visa when they want to study in France. And so this was a reactive change because of the hard Brexit that the UK had decided on. In the normative dimension, I found a strengthened focus on intra-European student mobility. So for many years before, the French higher education sector had this strategy of, okay, we want to have as many partnerships as possible, global outlook. But in this time of crisis, there was really this focus on securing European relationships, on making the European higher education sector stronger, and on, of course, trying to find replacement Erasmus mobility spots for the UK if it most likely was going to leave the mobility scheme. And another striking development was that President Macron instigated the European Universities Initiative, which is now one of the most ambitious education projects of the EU to date to foster EU social integration. And this idea of a European university wasn't new. It had been floating around since the 1950s, 1960s, but it had never come to fruition because member states couldn't agree on where such a brick and mortar university was going to be established. Some worried that there would be brain drain if one country got this flagship EU university. So it was always kind of put on the back burner again because the countries couldn't decide. But Macron brought this up again, this time a bit modified, with this idea of creating alliances of existing universities. So it took away this problematic factor before of where would this physical university be. And then it was actually very quickly implemented, right? So in 2017, he held his speech, and in 2019 already we had the first European University Alliances start their activities. So yeah, and this was spearheaded by the French president. When it comes to the cultural cognitive dimension, I argue that the regulative adjustments and the normative commitment to EU integration in the face of Brexit continued France's tradition of promoting European integration and collaboration. So there's this, often also in the literature, you find that France and Germany are sort of the motors of European integration. And this continued throughout Brexit. Which brings me to the German case, where I also found the same pattern of partial change. Similar to France, Germany recategorized the UK and now requires British students to apply for a residency permit. In the normative dimension, Germany also strengthened its focus on intra-European student mobility, both a bit out of defiance towards the UK. So many people I interviewed said, well, if they don't want to take part in this European integration project anymore, so be it. But we're going to be even stronger on this front right now. And this is very important to us. And they also extended or expanded partnerships with Northern and Eastern European universities who had recently also expanded their portfolio of English-speaking courses and programs so that they could make up for the potential loss or the decided loss then of UK universities as an Erasmus destination, which were always quite popular because many people want to practice their English. There was also a sense of opportunism as the German higher education sector thought that it could improve its standing in the global higher education market now that the UK was becoming less attractive for many students with the higher tuition fees for EU students. So they also saw this opportunity of attracting more students now. In the cultural cognitive dimension, similar to France, Germany continued with a strong conviction that European integration and collaboration were the way to proceed, which then represents stability and a continuation of what had happened before Brexit. Yeah, so regulative and normative changes in response to Brexit across all three countries. Taking a quick breath before we move on to the next disruption, the pandemic. And yeah, it's quite fitting to be talking about this today. I think I read today in the news that exactly 5 years ago was the last week we had of normalcy before basically everyone went into lockdown. So yeah, let's remember again what happened. And looking at the first case of England. And what was very striking is that we have, again, a partial change finding similar to Brexit, but with a different pattern. And what is also very remarkable is that COVID represented an entirely different disruption for England than it did for France and Germany. And the distinguishing feature was England's market-based approach to internationalization. So the pandemic represented a primarily financial threat for England, where the higher education sector highly depends on international students' tuition fees. And in light of the potential collapse of the higher education sector, in case international students could or would not come for an indefinite amount of time, right? We didn't know how long this would take. There was a real danger that the entire sector would collapse. And so in light of this potential collapse, the higher education sector called for governmental support measures, but the UK government did not introduce the stabilizing policies that were requested by the sector, such as increasing funds or the advanced distribution of collected tuition fees, for instance. So despite this crisis, the English government adhered to its existing regulations and there were no financial support policies. Of course, what was then also surprising was that the feared reduction of incoming international students did not actually occur. England quite quickly adopted this policy of reopening its borders to international students, and a lot of people actually enrolled, also likely because there was a Brexit effect as well, where many EU students thought, okay, this is the last year where we have those reduced tuition fees, we're going to enroll now. So the number of international students didn't actually go down, and this feared financial development did not actually take place, which then meant that very quickly things could go back to before. And this whole discussion of should we reform the higher education sector and the market-based approach kind of went, subsided, because other problems were then more pressing, Brexit also. In the normative dimension, what we will see for France and Germany is that there was a big change of norms regarding the state of digitalization and its spread. But in England, the state of digitalization was already very advanced in the higher education sector, given that, for instance, transnational online degree programs are a key aspect of the sector's education offer. And the market-based structure also makes it more pressing for universities to have good digital infrastructures, which is not so much the case for France and Germany. So unlike in Germany, for example, the pandemic in England did not change any norms regarding the acceptability of online learning, but it did legitimize the increased focus on what one interviewee called digital routes to market in the form of online student recruitment. So because this financial threat was so big, what was really focused on in terms of internationalization strategies was mostly recruitment through online measures such as online education fairs, for instance, also held by the British Council. Overall, when we look at the cultural cognitive dimension, despite the fact that the pandemic nearly resulted in the financial collapse of the education system, the country stuck with its market approach, and there was also little coordination or collaboration across the sector. I remember one interview also said it was like being in a room with friends with daggers when he was in a WhatsApp group with other internationalization officers, because everyone, of course, wanted to support each other, but having to secure the survival of one's organization, of course, took precedence. Looking at France, we see that the pandemic represented an entirely different crisis. The system is state-funded, so this aspect of financing was not prominent. But unlike in England, digital infrastructures were less developed, and the pandemic therefore led to the introduction of regulations for online education, which was not very common before. And in France, the pandemic also accelerated the already planned digitalization of the visa application process for international students, which had been decided in the 2018 Bienvenue en France strategy, which was the country's first internationalization strategy. But because these digitalization reforms were quite cumbersome, it had always sort of been put to the back burner, and people were a bit hesitant to get started with it. One person at the education ministry told me, but then of course, with the pandemic and the move online and in-person services being suspended, it became a priority. So generally, the pandemic legitimized and accelerated digitalization measures across French universities, also in terms of online education provision or online advising, for instance. In terms of the cultural cognitive dimension, there was a strong state-led response to COVID, with the French Education Ministry coordinating the pandemic response top-down to the universities. And there was also a lot of collaboration, both across French universities and with partner universities abroad. So sharing resources, having people attend courses from each other, which is not something that was very prominent in the English higher education sector. Looking at the last case, Germany. I also have a quote from one of the French experts who said that, the pandemic accelerated already ongoing change, and it becomes very clear in this quote that he gave, where he said, it's evolution and not revolution in the internationalization in response to COVID. Yeah, in terms of the German case, similar to France, the pandemic prompted the introduction of regulations on online education. So before, online education was very limited, also because there were big privacy concerns in the German system. And people had basically always shied away from using a lot of online softwares. And it also led to the legitimization and acceleration of lagging digitalization measures. So there had already been a big discussion, okay, we need more digitalization in the higher education sector, but because it was also cumbersome, especially because of privacy regulations, this had not taken place yet to the speed that some policymakers had wished for. Quite strikingly, Germany differs from the two other cases by the fact that it introduced virtual mobility as a systematic pillar of internationalization. So the German Academic Exchange Service, very quickly after the breakout of COVID, launched 2 funding calls that incentivized the academic community to leverage the intersection of digitalization and internationalization. So they had one funding call for the creation of collaboratively created online international courses, so COIL courses. So on the course level, they provided money for German instructors to work together with other lecturers abroad to co-design a course. And there was also a funding call for the creation of international master's programs with a blended learning component. And so this creation of this virtual pillar of internationalization shows how Germany's pandemic response, remained anchored in a state-led collaborative internationalization approach. So there was targeted funding provided from the state for collaboration also across borders. And there was this explicit involvement of the academic community, and especially having this teaching component so present, I think, was quite striking, because in France and in England, most of the activities were surrounded the recruitment of international students, and not so much the pedagogy and the delivery of education. So this led me to conclude that in Germany, the cultural cognitive dimension remained stable as it remained state-led, with this involvement of the academic community. So we've now looked at Brexit and COVID together, and let's compare now what we found in the 2 disruptions. Next slide, please. What we find is that in every crisis and country combination, there was partial institutional change, with at least the cultural cognitive dimension remaining stable. So both with Brexit and with COVID, in all countries, we had regulative and normative changes, but no cultural cognitive changes. And what can we infer from these results? Next slide, please. If you remember, in the beginning of the presentation, I gave you some examples of the speculations, right, that people had when the disruptions were starting, saying Brexit and COVID will forever change the way internationalization is being done. What I found then through my study is that there was no radical change in any of the disruption country combinations. So the cultural cognitive dimension always remained stable. This overall approach to internationalization remained stable. And this also suggests that the transformative impact of the disruptions was overestimated by contemporary witnesses. And I think we also know this now, seeing how things have evolved and that we've pretty much gone back to in-person teaching, that this radical change to the online sphere did not happen. And click again, please. The disruption-induced acceleration of already ongoing incremental change. So we already had this this digitalization reform agenda for France and Germany that was just going slowly, but then accelerated through the pandemic, for instance. This challenges the classical theoretical dichotomy between exogenously prompted critical junctures and endogenous actor-driven gradual institutional change. So usually in the literature, people look at crisis or at gradual institutional change coming from within the institution. But here we saw that an exogenous shock can actually accelerate already ongoing incremental change that institutional actors were already working on. Next slide, please. And there are, of course, many avenues for further research resulting from this study, right? We could look and apply this model that I provided to further country cases, for instance, to different governance types. So looking at more market-based higher education systems or more state-based higher education systems. We could look at how the events unfolded in higher education systems of different degrees of internationalization. We could look at different types of higher education organizations. So I looked at large research universities in all 3 countries that are, of course, the ones that have the most international outlook. But what about, for instance, more regionally oriented or smaller universities, or more universities of more applied sciences, for instance? Or one could also, of course, apply this model to other disruptive events. And unfortunately, we had quite a few of them: the Russian war on Ukraine, energy crisis, etc. So this model could also help us explore further disruptions. Okay, I'm losing my voice. And the analytical framework could, of course, also be applied to the same cases at a later point in time. So I stopped the empirical data collection in 2021. But of course, now with more hindsight, we could investigate the stickiness of the developments that I found at a later point in time to see, okay, did everything actually go back to the way it was before? What kind of changes remained, which didn't? So yeah, there is a lot more to explore in terms of the implications of the disruptions. Yeah, so much for now. Next slide, please. If you would like to know more about the different country cases or look at the developments in more detail, then please check out my book. And yeah, I look forward to your comments and questions.
Great, thank you, Anna. And thank you, Rebecca, for handling the slides very adeptly. It's 5 years, gosh, that feels like it's longer, but also interesting thinking about how this webinar series begins in COVID, and so I guess one of the things I'm interested in terms of the model of exogenous shock is and please others join in and comments on the chat as well, because I think others will have really perspectives on this. But the assumption is that exogenous shock causes profound change, isn't it? That's the argument. Are there examples of universities that would have gone through that? When we think of universities as quite sort of inertia-bound institutions, as in they don't change very fast, it's almost part of the institutional culture. So I guess my question probably is more for the institutional theory. Do universities fit that model of, could one imagine a profound change in a university as a result of an exogenous shock?
I mean, an interesting example would be the end of the Cold War and the transition that unfolded in many previously Soviet countries, I think. And there we can see that marketization measures were taken, but they also took time, right? Because the pre-existing models of how things were done were, of course, still very prevalent within the people working in the institution. And then this more global and capitalist influence only gradually then seeped into the ways the universities were governed or how research was being produced. But it's a very interesting question. But overall, universities are quite resistant to change, also because they're such loosely organized organizations with lots of decoupling from what is happening maybe at one level and then the other.
That's really interesting, and I think my follow-on point was actually in some ways we are changing, and cultural cognitive, it might happen more slowly, but I'm now teaching all the time in a hybrid way, and that's brand new, isn't it? And whether that's COVID-induced or whether that's the technology, most of the time enabling us to do that. But I think there are ways in which quietly institutions do change as well, even if we slightly deny that they do. So yeah, you're right about the sort of loosely coupledness, but also our reflexive nature. So and it was great, a really interesting talk, and really think interesting to compare these two very different shocks and these very different institutions. Rachel, please come in.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Anna. I really enjoyed that, and apologies my camera isn't working. But I was just wondering if you could just sort of reflect on the stickiness point, but also I suppose a methodological point about kind of what people say in an interview at a time of disruption, because we've been interviewing some international office staff about the Turing scheme, which has replaced Erasmus. And I would say that, their view is that, that there has actually been quite profound change in relation to credit mobility in the UK. And I wonder whether in your interviews there might have been a sense that, we are going to fight this, we don't like this, we're going to try and keep things as similar as possible, as almost sort of a political defensive response. I just wondered if you got any sense of that in your interviews at all, or whether you think that's not a fair comment to make.
No, absolutely. I did find that, and I think the resistance that I got from the interviewees was, there were really explicit comments being made, and this distancing also from the government policy, both symbolically and through the ways they handled their mobility partnerships, for instance, where they said, okay, we're going to adopt Turing, of course, because we have, it's there now, it's the funding that's being provided, but we will also try to find ways to maintain what was done before. So still keeping those Erasmus partnerships, but maybe channeling funds in a different way to them, or there was definitely this aspect visible in my interviews as well.
Thank you.
Great, thank you, Anna. Thank you, Rachel. Mike, you added a comment in the chat. Do you want to ask it?
Yes, I suppose it's that kind of thing about the differential impact on some UK universities, where we can see some universities, like Kent's badged itself as the European university, and then other people were either further away or had less markets and that. So there's kind of, although Brexit was a shock, it may have had very different impacts on different institutions because of their student mix. But the pandemic, apart from the smug online universities who could just say it's, we're continuing on the same kind of way, affected all of us. Is there a differential, therefore, between different types of universities and their play, and therefore Brexit has less of an overall system impact because it only affected some universities profoundly and others were okay?
It of course affected those the most that had increasingly come to rely on, EU students and those that are perhaps more regionally oriented, where international students don't play such a big role. That was less of an impact. But those visa changes affected all universities. The loss of Erasmus, I think, whether there were lots of Erasmus students or few, it was something that had to be handled on the organizational level. There is, of course, in the methodology this difference that Brexit and COVID are not quite similar, in that COVID is really this exogenous shock that hit everyone the same way, whereas with Brexit, of course, England also being the most prominent country in the UK had a different kind of agency than France and Germany, who were more like reacting as part of the EU countries, and had to, of course, find a coherent voice together as well. A good point to make, for sure.
Great, thanks, Mike. John, do you want to come in and ask your question about how we have transformed slowly, gently?
Thank you, David. Yes. Sorry, it's another question about England, Anna, but thank you for your presentation, which is very interesting. But I agree with you that in relation to COVID, we've largely returned to face-to-face teaching, although, as David has said, we do have hybrid teaching. But it seems to me that university life generally has been transformed by COVID. And certainly in my experience, online meetings and research seminars are generally online, with face-to-face being the exception. So perhaps it could be said that in England, at least, organisational life has been considerably transformed by COVID, and certainly the corridors are quieter than pre-COVID in my experience.
Yes, for sure. And I think the same also is true for the German case. I think that the sort of the conclusions I made were very specific to internationalization and student mobility, where I think we are now also have much more virtual exchange COIL formats, but still I think for most the gold standard or the norm is still physical exchange. And so this idea that was floating around in the beginning, oh, maybe transnational education or virtual exchange will now become the norm, also because we're more concerned with sustainability impacts of physical travel. That was there, but still everyone was sort of more eager to return to the norm of physical cross-border mobility. At least that's what I found in my research.
Yeah, fair point. Thank you.
Yeah.
Great, thanks, John. Asoda, do you want to ask your question comparing Brexit and COVID? Asoda Tivasan, are you able to unmute? Would you like me to ask the question for you? Well, in which case, perhaps Anna, do you just want to read it?
Yeah, sure. So Asoda stated that during the COVID and the post-COVID era, online learning, distance learning has moved from the periphery of higher education system to center stage. It no longer has to justify its legitimacy. So impact of Brexit has been less strong compared to COVID, whose impact has been worldwide. What do you think?
Interesting.
Yeah, I mean, the legitimization aspect, that for sure is something that I found in the normative dimension. The idea of what is considered legitimate provision of education or a legitimate way of meeting has definitely changed. In terms of, I can't really say like which impact has been stronger or not, right? It's not quantifiable in that respect. That's not what I try to do. And of course, Brexit concerns the EU and the UK. It does not have this global impact, of course, that COVID had, with literally like everyone being affected. So there is that difference too, that there's a different crisis, right? One is a global health crisis. One is a political, not a crisis because it was more produced by the actors through the vote. So it's a different kind of event.
Great, yes, and we're still desperately missing being part of the EU. Anna, can I ask about the question that you pointed out to the way in which Macron and the German leaders use Brexit to justify the EUI? Was that the direct? Did they directly say we need the EUI because of Brexit?
No, so there is this Sorbonne speech that Macron gave in 2017, where he proposed a range of measures to fortify the EU against, he calls it like threats of nationalism or populism or easy solutions. So he never explicitly says Brexit, but then it's very clear also when you look in the literature that all of these themes have been amply discussed in the context of Brexit. So I sort of made the link through that. It's indirectly, but I think it was really this moment of crisis that led to this reallocation of costs and attention and work towards this Europeanization measure of the European Universities Initiative that before maybe wouldn't have had such a momentum.
Okay, that's really interesting. So there was a sort of concentration of minds. Okay,
Yeah.
we have two last questions. Hedwig, you wanted to ask a question about method. Do you want to come in and ask that?
Thank you very much for this interesting presentation. I was just wondering, perhaps you could point out a little bit more in detail your methods. Have there been any challenges in measuring the impact over time? So how did you proceed? Thank you.
Yeah, that is a great question. Also one that I had in my defense and everything. It's of course a very particular study in that I was sort of covering the things as they were unfolding, and of course that when I interviewed the different people between 2020 and 2021. Things were unfolding. So what people were saying was always in response to sort of the most recent events. And that also kind of course, affected which of the two disruptions received more attention in the respective interview, even though I asked mostly the same questions. So in that way, it's not like a super standardized way of covering things. It's just the nature of the project was very particular in sort of looking at the change as it was happening and then trying to make sense of it. So I think there's definitely also value in what I said in the last slides, in checking again now with some more distance to it, what the developments have been and what kinds of developments have been sticky or not. But yeah, I mean, whenever something new happened with Brexit, I then of course covered it with the respective interviewees. People had very strong emotions about this. It was definitely an interesting study to do. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, Hedwig. And yes, it's painful to be reminded of just how long and drawn out that car crash was. A last question from Mustafa about international student tuition fees.
Yes, thank you very much for the enlightening presentation, Anna. I'm just wondering, can you make a comparison in terms of these three countries' policies on international students' tuition fees and how these policies affecting number of students in recent years going to these countries? And also, I know that Turkey is also quite very much interested in increasing the number of international students, and Turkey is taking a different policy in terms of the tuition fee compared to the rest of the Europe. So how do you compare these countries? Thank you.
Yeah, it's a very good point. They're very different. We have England, where tuition fees were introduced. When was it? In the 2000s, and they were increased gradually over time. And of course, this change from EU students no longer having this freedom of movement and similar access to higher education as domestic students, of course, meant that the tuition fees went from like £9,000 to 27,000 or whichever number the respective degree costs. So this was a big change, and also has resulted in the numbers of EU students choosing the UK going down because it's just much less affordable now. In France, they introduced low tuition fees as part of this Bienvenue en France strategy, because they were saying, okay, we want to use, it was like maybe 2,000. I don't have the exact number in my head right now, but they said, okay, we want to have this also to signal that it's quality education. Also, we want to use these funds to create support mechanisms for international students. But there was a big backlash by the higher education sector. Many universities actually did not implement the tuition fees, although the government had given these guidelines of introducing them, because they said it would be discriminating, particularly to those students coming from lower income countries. And in Germany, I think except for one state, international students still have the same access to education, which is basically free. It's like maybe 400 euros or something, administrative fee, as German students, which, yeah, there's a discussion about whether this is sustainable also, because the dropout rate of international students is higher than that of domestic students, and whether that is sustainable, and also in the interest, of course, of the country to educate people who then maybe leave. But for now, there are still virtually no tuition fees in Germany. And of course, it's also part of the attraction strategy now to get in more people. Yeah.
Great, thank you very much, Mustafa. That's a good question. And Anna, a huge thank you to you, because you've done a brilliant job despite the disruption of tech. And I never knew Teams would be so unhelpfully un-Teams-like, but you survived. Thank you also to Rachel, and that your material is really interesting. So do everyone have a look at Anna's book. It's called Higher Education in an Age of Disruption. And I think you show us the value here of a careful comparative approach. Next week we're talking about student loneliness, and we're comparing Japan and the UK with Ivana Panova. Please join us again, and of course we have our own conference coming up in April, Global Rupture, thinking about disruptions at a geopolitical level. Do join us for those as well. Anna, thank you again, and we look forward to welcoming you back at another time with more research. Thanks everyone for joining us. See you again next week. Thank you. Bye-bye.
David and Rachel.
Bye-bye.